The medication cup slipped from Margaret Dalton's fingers at exactly 11:43 p.m. pills scattering across the pristine white floor of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital like tiny soldiers abandoned on a battlefield. She dropped to her knees immediately, dirty blonde hair falling loose from its deliberately messy bun, shoulders hunched forward as trembling hands scrambled to retrieve the capsules one by one. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead cast unforgiving shadows across her face, making the dark circles under her eyes look like bruises. Her medium blue scrubs hung loose on her small 5'4" frame, deliberately oversized, the fabric swallowing any hint of the compact athletic build hidden underneath. She looked exactly like what she wanted them to see, a nervous, incompetent nurse who had no business working in a hospital. Unbelievable. Doctor. Vincent Hartwell's voice cut through the corridor like a scalpel through skin. He stood tall at 6 feet, impeccably groomed with perfectly styled salt and pepper hair, his pristine white coat practically glowing under the lights. His expensive Rolex caught the fluorescent glare as he gestured dismissively at her. This is the third time this week, Dalton. Do you have any idea what those medications cost? Or is basic competence too much to ask from our night shift? Margaret kept her head down, fingers still trembling as she picked up the last pill. Her hospital ID badge swung from its basic lanyard. The thin scar above her left eyebrow, 3 centimeters long and partially hidden by loose strands of hair, caught the light for just a moment before she ducked her head lower. I'm sorry, Dr. Hartwell. It won't happen again. That's what you said last time. He stepped closer, invading her space, his polished dress shoes stopping inches from her crouched position. 2 other nurses paused in the hallway, watching with barely concealed amusement. Jessica Bennett from Pediatrics actually smirked. You know what? Stay there. Don't get up yet. I want you to think about how much you're costing this hospital while you're down there on your knees where you apparently belong. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes there and gone in an instant like lightning behind storm clouds. Her jaw tightened microscopically. The small scars on the backs of her hands, remnants of shrapnel from another life, caught the light as her fingers momentarily stopped shaking and curled into fists. Then the moment passed. Her shoulders curved forward again. Her head dropped lower. The tremor returned to her hands as she carefully placed the pills back into the cup. Yes, doctor. Pathetic. Hartwell shook his head, addressing the watching nurses with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced real consequences. This is what happens when hospitals start hiring based on sympathy rather than skill. She's probably here because some veteran preference program forced HR's hand. Isn't that right, Dalton? What was it, desk duty for the Army filing paperwork at some base in Kansas? He laughed, and the other nurses joined in, their voices echoing down the sterile hallway. I can't imagine you doing anything that actually mattered. Margaret stood slowly, keeping her eyes down, arms close to her body. The elastic band on her right wrist had left a slight indentation in her pale skin. She snapped it once, twice, the quiet sound lost under Hartwell's continued commentary. I'll dispose of these properly and get new medications, Dr. Hartwell. See that you do. And Dalton, try not to kill anyone tonight with your incompetence. We've got a full ER, and I don't need to waste time cleaning up after you. He turned on his heel, coat billowing dramatically, and strode away down the corridor. The watching nurses dispersed, whispering and giggling among themselves. Margaret stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the medication cup in her trembling hands. Her dirty blonde hair had fallen completely out of its bun, now hanging loose around her face, hiding her expression from the security cameras mounted in the corners. When she finally moved, it was with the same hesitant, shuffling steps she always used. Short strides, head down, making herself as small and invisible as possible. Her white nursing shoes, worn and comfortable, made almost no sound on the tile floor as she headed toward the medication disposal unit. The night shift at St. Catherine's Memorial was usually quiet, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Mostly routine cases, occasional drunks stumbling in from 6th Street, minor injuries from the university crowd. Margaret preferred it that way. Fewer people to interact with, fewer chances to slip up, fewer moments where the mask might crack and reveal what lay beneath. She'd been here for 8 months now, carefully maintaining her cover, keeping her head down, letting them think she was nothing more than a mediocre nurse with shaky hands and low self-esteem. It was easier that way, safer. She disposed of the pills, properly documenting the waste in the medication log. Her handwriting was neat despite the apparent tremor in her hands. The documentation was perfect, something that had confused Dr. Hartwell initially until he decided she probably just copied someone else's format. He never looked closely enough to see how precise her notes actually were, how her medical assessments were consistently accurate even when her delivery seemed uncertain. Rough night, the voice behind her was kind. Dr. Preston Whitfield, one of the ER physicians who actually treated staff with respect. He was in his 50s with gray streaks in his brown hair and smile lines around his eyes that suggested he'd spent a lifetime finding reasons to be optimistic. Margaret glanced up briefly, managing a small apologetic smile. Just clumsy, Dr. Whitfield. Nothing new. Hartwell is an ass. Whitfield said it quietly, checking to make sure they were alone in the medication room. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed too many small cruelties, but lacked the institutional power to stop them. Don't let him get to you. I've seen your patient notes. You're better than he gives you credit for. He paused, studying her with the careful attention of a physician who noticed details others missed. Actually, you're better than most of the nurses on day shift. Your assessments are always spot on, even if you don't seem confident about them. Something shifted in Margaret's posture. A microsecond of straightening of pride before she caught herself and hunched forward again. Thank you, Dr. Whitfield. That means a lot. He studied her for a moment, something curious in his expression, but then his pager went off. The shrill beep cut through the quiet of the medication room. Incoming trauma. MV, with ejection. ET, A 5 minutes. Can you set up Bay 3? Of course. Margaret moved immediately. Her steps were still small and hesitant, but her hands suddenly steadier as she began preparing the trauma bay. Whitfield noticed the change but didn't comment, heading toward the ambulance bay to meet the incoming patient. Trauma. This was where things got dangerous for her. This was where instincts kicked in, where decades of training threatened to surface, where the muscle memory of 1,000 combat casualty scenarios tried to override her carefully maintained incompetence. She forced her hands to tremble again as she pulled out supplies, deliberately fumbling with an IV kit, making sure the other nurse in the bay saw her struggle. God, Dalton, just let me do it. Jessica Bennett huffed, taking the IV kit from her with an exasperated sigh. Why are you even in trauma? You should be in the clinic or something, handing out Band-Aids to kids with scraped knees. Sorry. Margaret murmured, stepping back, making herself small again. Inside part of her was calculating. Motor vehicle accident with ejection, patient thrown from vehicle, high likelihood of head trauma, internal bleeding, possibly tension, pneumothorax if there was chest impact. She'd seen hundreds of these cases, had treated them under mortar fire in the backs of moving vehicles in conditions that would make this pristine American emergency room look like a luxury resort. But Jessica and the others couldn't know that. No one could know that. The ambulance arrived, sirens wailing, cutting through the quiet Austin night. Paramedics rushed in with the patient, a young man in his 20s, unconscious, obvious head trauma, breathing labored. Dr. Whitfield started calling orders immediately, the team moving with practiced efficiency. Margaret stayed in the background, fetching supplies when asked, doing the simple tasks, keeping her hands visibly shaky, staying out of the way. But her eyes never stopped moving, scanning the monitors, watching the patient's vitals, noting the asymmetric chest rise, the left side not expanding properly. Possible pneumothorax. Whitfield hadn't caught it yet. He was focused on the head injury, calling for a CT scan, managing the immediate threats. The patient's oxygen saturation was dropping. 94, 92, 90. Margaret's hands clenched. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene. One simple procedure, needle decompression. Second intercostal space mid-clavicular line. 14-gauge angiocath. 15 seconds and she could fix it. But that would raise questions. That would make them look at them differently. That would threaten everything she'd built here. The safe, invisible life she'd carved out for herself after everything fell apart. The patient's oxygen saturation hit 88. His lips were turning blue. Dr. Whitfield. Margaret said it quietly, her voice barely audible over the organized chaos. He didn't hear her. She tried again, slightly louder, forcing herself to sound uncertain. Dr. Whitfield, maybe. His left chest isn't moving. Whitfield glanced up, irritated at the interruption, but then he looked at the patient. Really looked. His eyes widened with the recognition of someone who just missed something critical. Damn it. Decreased breath, sounds left side. Tension pneumothorax. Get me a needle decompression kit. Now. Jessica ran for the kit while Whitfield positioned himself. Margaret stayed back, watching with a carefully neutral expression as Whitfield performed the procedure she could have done faster, cleaner, with one hand tied behind her back. The hiss of escaping air, the immediate improvement in the patient's breathing, the oxygen saturation climbing back up. Whitfield had done it correctly. He was a good doctor, but it had taken him 90 seconds. She could have done it in 15. Good catch, Dalton. Whitfield said it over his shoulder, surprise evident in his voice. That could have been bad. Just lucky. Margaret mumbled, looking at her feet. Jessica shot her a skeptical glance but said nothing. The rest of the trauma was routine. Stabilized CT scan transfer to ICU. Margaret cleaned up the bay afterward, her movements slow and methodical, maintaining her clumsy persona even though her mind was racing. That had been close. Too close. She'd almost intervened directly, almost blown her cover over one patient, when she'd maintained this charade for 8 months specifically to avoid moments like this. The ER settled back into relative quiet around 1 a.m. Margaret made her rounds checking on patients, documenting everything in her careful handwriting, avoiding Dr. Hartwell, who was now in his office doing paperwork and probably complaining about her to whoever would listen. The other nurses mostly ignored her, which was exactly what she wanted. Invisible, unremarkable, safe. She was restocking supply closet 4 when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. Distant but distinct, growing louder with each passing second. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors. Heavy rotors. Military heavy. Margaret's head snapped up. Her entire body went suddenly motionless. Every muscle locked. Her breathing became controlled, measured automatic. Her eyes went sharp and focused in a way they never were during her shifts. She moved to the window, looking out into the night sky. There, running lights cutting through the darkness. The unmistakable silhouette of a UH-60 Black Hawk approaching fast and low over the Austin skyline. The elastic band on her wrist snapped once as her hands curled into fists. That wasn't a medical evacuation helicopter. That was a military bird, and it was coming here. Her jaw clenched, the thin scar above her eyebrow suddenly visible as she pushed her hair back unconsciously, her posture straightening without her realizing it. The Black Hawk descended toward the hospital's helipad rotors, churning the air, and Margaret felt something stir deep in her chest. Something she'd been suppressing for 8 months. Something she'd hoped she could keep buried forever. The sound of those rotors brought back memories she didn't want. Faces she'd lost, decisions she'd made, a life she'd walked away from, a different helicopter, a different desert. Yemen, 8 months ago. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Execute. Go. Her own voice younger but carrying the same command authority, giving the order over encrypted comms. 16 operators moving into a compound. Intelligence said it was clear. Intelligence was wrong. The sound of gunfire over the radio, screaming. Men she'd trained with fought alongside, calling for backup that couldn't reach them in time. All 16 dead in 8 minutes. And then her own Black Hawk shot down during extraction. The world spinning, fire and metal, and the screaming of hydraulics failing. The pilots dying on impact. Her throne clear surviving when she shouldn't have. Margaret, the voice was sharp concern. Jessica Bennett stood in the doorway of the supply closet looking at her with something between worry and confusion. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Margaret forced her shoulders to hunch forward again. Forced the tremor back into her hands. Forced herself to become small and invisible once more. I'm fine, just heard the helicopter. Startled me. Jessica's expression softened slightly. It's landing on our helipad. Some kind of military emergency transport, I think. Hartwell's freaking out because nobody gave us advance notice. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She turned back to the supply shelves, using the mundane task of organizing bandages to hide the fact that her hands were shaking for real now. Whatever was in that helicopter, whatever was about to come through those ER doors, it was going to change everything. She could feel it. The same instinct that had kept her alive through deployments in 4 different countries. The same sixth sense that had warned her when ambushes were coming, when intelligence was compromised, when everything was about to go sideways. The rotors grew louder, closer, the downwash rattling the windows. Margaret Dalton forced herself to keep arranging supplies with trembling hands. But inside, in the part of herself she'd locked away 8 months ago, Major General Margaret Reaper Dalton was already assessing threats, calculating variables, preparing for whatever came next. The night shift was about to get very, very complicated. The Black Hawk touched down on the hospital's rooftop helipad with practiced precision, its rotors creating a downwash that rattled windows and set off car alarms in the parking lot below. Margaret watched from the ER entrance as the side door slid open before the skids even fully settled, and figures emerged moving with the coordinated efficiency of operators who'd done this 1,000 times. 4 men, no 5, all massive. All armed, all moving with a purpose that made every civilian security guard in the vicinity take an instinctive step backward. Even from a distance, Margaret could identify the gear. Multicam plate carriers, HK-416 rifles with suppressors and optics, high-cut ballistic helmets, tactical headsets, but it was the patches that made her breath catch in her throat. Even in the dim lighting, she could see the reversed American flag on the right shoulder. The specific way they moved. The equipment loadout. The fact that they'd landed a military helicopter at a civilian hospital without warning. Navy SEALs. What the hell? Jessica peered beside Margaret, staring up at the rooftop access door. Is that the military? Are we being invaded or something? I don't know, Margaret murmured, but her hands had stopped shaking. Her eyes tracked every movement as the SEALs moved toward the rooftop access door, two of them carrying a stretcher between them. Even from here, she could see the dark stains on the tactical gear of the man on the stretcher. Blood, a lot of it. Dr. Hartwell emerged from his office, irritation written across his perfect features. What's all the noise about Whitfield? Do you know anything about? He stopped mid-sentence as the rooftop access door burst open and the SEALs entered the ER, bringing with them the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. The man in the lead was enormous. 6'4", at least probably 240 pounds of solid muscle, barely contained by his coyote brown tactical pants and tan t-shirt. His plate carrier was loaded with magazines, medical supplies, and communications equipment. A close-cropped beard covered his jaw, and even in the fluorescent hospital lighting, Margaret could see the scar cutting through his right eyebrow. His dark eyes swept the ER with the alertness of someone who'd survived too many ambushes to ever be caught off guard. Around his neck, visible against his tan shirt, hung a SEAL trident on a chain. We need a doctor. Now. His voice carried the kind of command that made people move without thinking. Critical GSW to the chest, possible tension pneumothorax. Lost a lot of blood. He's been stable for transport, but he's deteriorating. Doctor. Hartwell stepped forward, his earlier irritation replaced by professional concern, though Margaret could see him straightening his coat, smoothing his hair, even now, worried about appearance. I'm Dr. Vincent Hartwell, attending physician. Trauma Bay 1. What's the patient's? His name's classified. The lead SEAL cut him off, not rudely, but with absolute finality. What you need to know, gunshot wound to the right upper chest. Entry wound only, bullet still lodged, packed with combat gauze. Pressure dressing applied 20 minutes ago. He's had about 4 units of blood replacement. Probably needs more. No known allergies. Blood type O negative. He paused, his dark eyes finding Hartwell's and holding them. Now can we move? They were already moving, carrying the stretcher toward Trauma Bay, one not waiting for permission. The other SEALs fanned out automatically, taking up positions that gave them clear sight lines of all entrances. They weren't just securing the patient. They were securing the entire ER. Margaret recognized the pattern immediately. These men expected trouble to follow them. The patient on the stretcher was younger, maybe early 30s, with the same athletic build as his team. His tactical gear had been partially cut away to access the wound, revealing a compression bandage dark with blood. His face was pale lips, slightly blue, breathing rapid and shallow. Margaret's trained eye assessed him in seconds. Significant blood loss. Possible developing tension pneumothorax despite the combat gauze. Tachycardic, likely going into shock. Dr. Hartwell began issuing orders as they moved into the trauma bay, and Margaret found herself following, automatically staying in the background as always, but unable to look away. Jessica and Dr. Whitfield joined them along with another nurse named David Sullivan. The room filled quickly, too quickly, with the 4 medically trained hospital staff and 5 heavily armed SEALs who refused to leave their teammate. I need you all to step back, Hartwell said it, addressing the SEALs with the kind of tone he probably thought projected authority. This is a sterile environment, and you're contaminating it. Wait outside. The lead SEAL didn't even acknowledge him. He moved to the head of the stretcher, one hand on his teammate's shoulder. Havoc to Ghost. Stay with me, brother. You're home. These docs are going to fix you up. Sir, I really must insist, Hartwell started. Then insist quietly while you work. The SEAL Havoc apparently cut him off again, his dark eyes fixed on Hartwell with an intensity that made the doctor actually step back. We don't leave our brothers. You do your job, we'll stay out of your way. But we're not leaving. Hartwell's jaw tightened, but he turned to the patient, pulling on gloves. Fine. Someone get me vitals, and I need portable x-ray. Blood work and blood pressure 70/40 and dropping. Dr. Whitfield called out, watching the monitor. Heart rate 140, respiratory rate 32, oxygen saturation 89%. Margaret stayed near the supply cabinet, her assigned position during traumas. Her hands clasped in front of her in their usual trembling grip, but her eyes never left the patient. She watched Hartwell examine the wound, saw him peel back the combat gauze carefully. The bullet had entered just below the right clavicle, probably missed the subclavian artery, or the patient would already be dead. But there was still significant bleeding. The trajectory suggested possible lung involvement. The bullet's still in there. Hartwell said it more to himself than anyone else. We'll need to get him to surgery for extraction. In the meantime, we need to stabilize. The patient's oxygen saturation alarm went off. 85%, 82. Margaret's entire body went rigid. She knew that sound, knew what it meant. Her eyes fixed on the patient's chest. The right side was rising normally, but the left side wasn't moving as much as it should. The trachea was starting to deviate. Jugular vein distension becoming visible. Tension pneumothorax. The lung had collapsed. Air building up in this chest cavity, with nowhere to go, putting pressure on the heart and great vessels. If it wasn't decompressed immediately, he'd arrest within minutes. Her hands stopped trembling. They curled into fists at her sides, nails digging into palms hard enough to hurt. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to move, to act, to fix it. She'd done this procedure hundreds of times, had performed it in the back of moving vehicles under fire, had taught it to dozens of combat medics. 14-gauge angiocath, second intercostal space midclavicular line. Insert until you hear the hiss of escaping air. 15 seconds, maybe 20. She could save his life, but she couldn't move, couldn't reveal herself, couldn't throw away 8 months of careful cover for one patient, no matter how much every instinct screamed at her to act. Dr. Hartwell, Whitfield's voice was urgent. Decreased breath sounds on the left. Tracheal deviation. JVD. He's got a tension pneumothorax, I can see that. Hartwell snapped, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. He looked around. Where's the needle decompression kit? Top drawer left side. Jessica said, but she was across the room, and in her rush to get it, she knocked over an IV pole. It crashed to the floor with a clatter that made everyone jump. 80% oxygen saturation. 78, Havoc's voice cut through the chaos, deadly calm. Doc, my brother is dying. Fix it. Now, Hartwell's hands were shaking as he finally got the kit open. He positioned the needle, trying to find the landmark. Second intercostal space midclavicular line, but his hands weren't steady. He'd done this procedure maybe 5 times in his career, always in controlled conditions, never on someone who was actively dying. 75%. The patient's lips were turning blue. Margaret's vision narrowed. Her breathing slowed, controlled, automatic. Combat breathing. 4 counts. In 4 counts, hold 4 counts out. Her hands hung steady at her sides, now ready. She took 1 step forward, then caught herself. She couldn't. She couldn't do this. If she intervened, if she showed what she really was, everything she'd built would collapse. They'd start asking questions. They'd dig into her background. They'd figure out who she really was. And then the past she'd been running from for 8 months would catch up to her. 72%. The monitor was screaming now. Dr. Hartwell inserted the needle, but his angle was wrong. Too medial, not lateral enough. He'd missed the intercostal space entirely. Might even hit the internal mammary artery. Margaret could see it from across the room. Could predict the exact moment he'd realize his mistake. Damn it, Hartwell muttered, pulling the needle back. I need to... The patient's eyes rolled back. His body went limp. He's arresting, Whitfield shouted, and Margaret moved. She didn't think about it, didn't plan it, didn't make a conscious choice. Her body simply moved with the muscle memory of 2 decades of combat medicine, crossing the space to the trauma bay in 4 long strides that were nothing like her usual shuffling steps. Her hands shot out and grabbed a fresh needle decompression kit from the supply cart without looking, her movements precise and economical. Move. She said it, and her voice was different. Not the hesitant, apologetic murmur they were used to, but a command voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. Dr. Hartwell actually stepped back, shocked into compliance. Margaret's hands perfectly steady, not even a hint of tremor, ripped open the kit. Her eyes were focused with surgical precision on the patient's chest. She didn't need to feel for landmarks. She could see them, the anatomy visible in her mind like an X-ray overlay. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line left side. Her fingers found the anatomical landmark with practiced certainty. The 14-gauge angiocath positioned with the speed of someone who'd done this under fire. She inserted it with controlled force, 45-degree angle, advancing until she felt the subtle pop of penetrating the pleura. The hiss of escaping air was immediate and dramatic. The patient's oxygen saturation began climbing. 75, 78, 82. His chest began rising symmetrically. His color started improving. The entire trauma bay was silent except for the steady beeping of the monitor and the hiss of air still escaping through the angiocath. Margaret stood over the patient, her hand still on the needle, her posture completely different from the hunched, submissive stance everyone was used to. Her shoulders were back, spine straight, head up. She was taller somehow, her small frame radiating a presence that filled the room. The dirty blonde hair that had been falling messily around her face was pushed back, revealing the thin scar above her left eyebrow clearly for the first time. Her eyes were sharp and alert, scanning the monitors, assessing the patient with professional efficiency. She looked nothing like the incompetent, nervous nurse they all knew. She looked like a soldier. The silence stretched. Then Havoc spoke, his voice, quiet but carrying clearly in the stunned room. That was a combat insertion. He moved closer, his 6'4" frame towering over her 5'4" height. But Margaret didn't step back, didn't hunch her shoulders like she normally would. She held her ground, maintaining eye contact with a man who'd probably seen more combat than most people could imagine. Angle, depth, speed. That wasn't textbook medicine. That was field procedure. Battlefield medicine. He paused, his gaze dropping to her hands, to the small scars on the backs of them. Marks she normally kept hidden, but which were now clearly visible under the harsh lights. "Where'd you learn to do that, ma'am?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her hands were still on the angiocath, monitoring it, making sure it stayed in position. Her eyes tracked the monitors. Oxygen saturation now at 91% and climbing. Heart rate decreasing from 140 to 120. Blood pressure stabilizing at 85/50. Better, but not good. He still needed surgery. Still needed blood. Still needed intensive care. But he wasn't dying anymore. "I didn't want to watch someone die when I could prevent it." She said it finally, and her voice was still that command tone. Steady, controlled, not apologetic, not uncertain, just factual. The night shift had changed, and Margaret Dalton's 8 months of hiding had just come to an end. "Doctor." Hartwell stared at Margaret with an expression caught between shock and anger. His perfectly maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. The trauma bay remained silent except for the steady rhythm of the monitors and the soft hiss of air escaping through the angiocath still positioned in the patient's chest. "What the hell did you just do?" Hartwell's voice rose with each word. "You're not authorized to perform that procedure. That's a physician-level intervention. You're a nurse, Dalton. What were you thinking?" And Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her hands remained on the angiocath, monitoring it with the kind of focus that suggested years of practice. Her eyes tracked the monitors with an efficiency that was impossible to miss now that the mask had slipped. Oxygen saturation 94% and climbing. Heart rate stabilizing at 115. Blood pressure holding at 88/52. Better. Still critical, but no longer circling the drain. "I was thinking I didn't want to watch someone die when I could prevent it." Margaret said it quietly, finally looking up from the patient. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the shocked expressions of the hospital staff, the calculating stares of the SEALs. She could feel her carefully constructed cover disintegrating in real time, could see the questions forming in everyone's minds. 8 months of hiding, gone in 15 seconds. Havoc had moved closer during the procedure. He now stood less than 3 feet from her, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made the other hospital staff uncomfortable. But Margaret didn't flinch, didn't look away. She'd faced worse scrutiny from harder men in more dangerous places. That was perfect placement. First try. Dr. Whitfield's voice carried genuine amazement. "I've seen attending physicians take 3 or 4 attempts to find the right spot. How did you learn to do that so precisely?" "Does it matter?" Margaret cut him off, but there was a weariness in her voice now. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by the cold realization of what she'd just exposed. The patient is stable. That's what matters. It matters when a nurse performs invasive procedures without authorization. Hartwell had recovered from his initial shock and was working himself into indignant fury. "You've just violated about a dozen hospital protocols. You don't have the authority or the training to perform procedures like that. I'm going to have to report this to administration. You can expect consequences, Dalton Baum. Administration can wait until after my brother's stable." Havoc's voice cut through Hartwell's building tirade. He didn't raise his volume, but there was an edge of steel underneath that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "Right now, I want to know who just saved his life." He turned back to Margaret, and something in his expression had changed. Recognition, maybe? Or the beginning of it, because whoever taught you that procedure, whoever trained you to move like that, he gestured at her posture, the way she held herself now that the submissive act had fallen away. "They didn't teach you that in nursing school. I think we should focus on the patient," Margaret said, trying to deflect. She attempted to make herself smaller again, to hunch her shoulders forward, but it looked forced now. The mask had slipped too far to put back on easily. "Your hands didn't shake once, Margaret." Dr. Whitfield's voice was quiet, almost sad. "Your hands always shake. It's one of your He stopped understanding, dawning on his face like sunrise breaking over a horizon. It was an act. The trembling, the nervousness, the dropping things, all of it was an act. Jessica spoke up from her position by the monitors, her voice mixing confusion with anger. Why would you pretend to be incompetent? We've all been covering for you for months, taking on extra work because we thought you were struggling. Were you just laughing at us, making fools of us? No. The word came out harder than Margaret intended, sharp enough to make Jessica take a step back. I never wanted anyone to cover for me. I never asked for that. I just wanted... She stopped herself, catching the vulnerability in her voice. But it was too late. They'd all heard it. I just wanted to be left alone. Well, that ship has sailed, Hartwell snapped, recovering his authority now that the immediate medical crisis had passed. You can't pull off something like this and expect everyone to just forget about it. I want answers. Who are you, really? What are you doing in my ER pretending to be something you're not? One of the other SEALs spoke up, for the first time, a younger operator with intelligent eyes and the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. Commander, we need to move Ghost to surgery. He's stable enough for transport now, but that bullet needs to come out, and he needs real blood replacement. Havoc nodded but didn't take his eyes off Margaret. Agreed. Whitfield, can you handle that? Yes. Dr. Whitfield said immediately, professional instincts overriding his curiosity. I'll call surgery, get a room prep, notify the blood bank. We'll take good care of him. I know you will. Havoc's tone made it clear that failure wasn't an option. Then he turned fully to Margaret, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched low enough that only she and maybe Whitfield could hear. We need to talk after he's out of surgery. There are some things I need to understand. I don't have anything to say to you, Margaret said, but even she could hear how weak it sounded. Ma'am, with all due respect, Havoc's eyes dropped to the scars on her hands again, then to the thin scar above her left eyebrow, then back to her face. I think you have a lot to say, and I think I need to hear it, especially if what I'm thinking is correct. What are you thinking? Margaret asked against her better judgment. I'm thinking I know maybe a dozen people in the entire world who could have performed that procedure that fast, that clean, under that much pressure. And all of them are either currently serving or recently retired from the military. Special operations medicine, combat medic training, probably 18 Delta qualification or higher. He paused, his gaze never wavering, which means you're not just some nurse who happened to learn a trick. You're trained, really trained. Margaret's jaw tightened. She didn't confirm or deny, but her silence was answer enough. Dr. Hartwell was listening now, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. What are you talking about? Special Operations Dalton is just a nurse. She has a civilian nursing degree, passed her boards, has a regular license. I've seen her personnel file. Personnel files can be scrubbed, the younger SEAL said quietly, especially for people who need to disappear. Disappear from what Jessica demanded. What is going on here? Dr. Whitfield was putting pieces together, his medical mind working through the evidence like a diagnostic puzzle. The way you assess patients, Margaret. Your documentation is always perfect. Trauma assessments that read like combat casualty reports. The terminology you use, sometimes military abbreviations, I only recognize because I did a rotation with the VA. And you always assess C-spine first, even on patients with zero indication of spinal trauma. He paused, the realization settling over him. That's battlefield protocol, not civilian ER procedure. A lot of nurses have military backgrounds, Margaret said defensively. Not like yours, Havoc said. He glanced at his team, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Look, I don't know your story. I don't know why you're hiding or what you're running from. But my brother's alive because of you, and that means something to me. He stepped closer, and there was something almost like respect in his eyes now. So I'm going to make you an offer. When he's out of surgery and stable, you and I are going to have a conversation. A real one. And depending on what you tell me, maybe I can help you. Or maybe I'll just say thank you and walk away. But either way, you don't have to keep pretending anymore. Not with us. I don't need your help, Margaret said, but her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Maybe not, Havoc acknowledged, but you saved one of my men. That creates a debt, and SEALs pay their debts. Before Margaret could respond, the trauma bay doors burst open and two orderlies arrived, with a transport gurney ready to move Ghost to surgery. The moment of intensity broke as everyone shifted back into medical mode. Dr. Whitfield coordinated the transfer, calling out orders, making sure all the monitors and IV lines were properly secured. The SEALs moved with the gurney, refusing to leave their teammate, their presence creating a bubble of contained violence as they moved through the sterile hospital corridors. Dr. Hartwell waited until they were gone before rounding on Margaret, his face flushed with anger, barely held in check. My office, now. We're going to have a very serious discussion about your future employment at this hospital. Dr. Hartwell, I really think Whitfield started, but Hartwell cut him off. Stay out of this, Preston. She violated protocol, performed a procedure she wasn't authorized for, and apparently has been lying to us about her qualifications for months. This is a legal and administrative nightmare. He pointed at Margaret. My office, 5 minutes. And bring your badge and ID because there's a very good chance you're walking out of this hospital unemployed. He stormed off, leaving Margaret standing in the middle of the trauma bay, suddenly alone, except for Whitfield and Jessica. Jessica was still processing her expression, caught between anger and confusion. I don't understand any of this. Who are you really? I'm exactly who I said I was, Margaret said quietly, some of the vulnerability creeping back into her voice. I'm a nurse. I'm licensed. Everything in my personnel file is legitimate. I just didn't tell the whole story. The whole story being what Jessica pressed, that you're some kind of military badass pretending to be incompetent. Why? What's the point? Margaret's hands began shaking again, but this time it looked genuine, not performed. The elastic band on her wrist snapped twice in rapid succession. Because sometimes the best way to survive is to make sure no one's looking at you. To be forgettable, invisible, safe. Safe from what, Whitfield asked gently. Margaret looked at him, and for just a moment her eyes showed something raw and painful. A glimpse of whatever she'd been running from, whatever had driven her to hide her true self for 8 months. But then she locked it down, the professional mask sliding back into place, even though everyone could see the cracks in it now. I need to go talk to Dr. Hartwell. He's right about one thing. I did violate protocol. I knew the risks when I did it. I'll accept the consequences. Margaret Whitfield started, but she was already walking away. Her stride somewhere between the shuffling, hesitant steps she normally used and the confident military bearing she'd shown in the trauma bay. Like she couldn't quite decide which version of herself to be anymore. Whitfield and Jessica watched her go. After a moment, Jessica said quietly, "Did we ever actually know her at all?" "I don't think so," Whitfield admitted. "But I think maybe we're about to find out." In the hallway, Margaret passed a window that reflected her appearance. Dirty blonde hair, messy and falling loose from its bun. Medium blue scrubs still hanging oversized on her frame. The thin scar above her left eyebrow, now clearly visible instead of hidden. She looked at her reflection and barely recognized herself. The careful disguise she'd maintained for 8 months had shattered in 15 seconds of instinct and training. Behind her, she could hear the distant sound of the Black Hawk's rotors spooling up for departure. Some of the SEALs would stay with their teammate through surgery, but eventually they'd leave. Eventually, this would all settle back to normal. Except it wouldn't, because now people were asking questions. Now people were looking at her. Now the invisible, forgettable nurse she'd worked so hard to become had become very, very visible. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded like her old commanding officer whispered what she'd known all along. You can hide from your past Reaper, but you can't hide from who you are. Not forever. Not when it counts. Margaret pushed the thought away and headed toward Dr. Hartwell's office. But this time her hands weren't trembling at all. Dr. Hartwell's office was exactly what Margaret expected. Diplomas covering one wall, expensive furniture, a desk that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He sat behind it now, fingers steepled, his perfect hair somehow still immaculate despite the case of the last hour. Margaret stood in front of the desk, hands at her sides, no longer clasped and trembling. She'd made a choice in the hallway. No more pretending, not even for him. "Sit," Hartwell commanded, gesturing to the chair across from him. Margaret remained standing. "I'd prefer not to," his eyebrows rose. "That wasn't a request, Dalton." "I know." Something in her voice made him pause. She wasn't being defiant exactly, but she wasn't being submissive either. There was a quiet strength there that he'd never heard before. "You're going to fire me regardless of whether I'm sitting or standing. So I'll stand." Hartwell leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression somewhere between anger and curiosity. "You're right, I am going to fire you. What you did tonight was reckless, unauthorized, and potentially opens this hospital to massive liability. You performed a procedure that only physicians are authorized to perform. You've been lying about your capabilities for months, and frankly, I have no idea who you actually are." "My credentials are legitimate," Margaret said quietly. "Registered nurse, current license, passed all required boards. I didn't lie about my qualifications." "No, you just hid them," Hartwell countered. "Which brings me to my question. Why, what kind of person deliberately makes themselves look incompetent? What are you hiding from Dalton, or is that even your real name?" Margaret's jaw tightened. It's my real name. And what I'm hiding from is none of your concern. It becomes my concern when it affects my ER. Hartwell shot back. Those SEALs think you're military. Special operations, they said. Is that true? Before Margaret could answer, the office door opened without a knock. Doctor. Whitfield stood there, his expression urgent. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. Hartwell, you need to come to the ER now. I'm in the middle of now. Whitfield repeated, and something in his tone made both Hartwell and Margaret move immediately. They followed Whitfield through the corridor back toward the ER. As they approached, Margaret could hear raised voices, the sound of something metal clattering to the floor. Her body tensed automatically, her stride lengthening, her senses sharpening, combat readiness flooding her system without conscious thought. The ER waiting room had transformed into something that looked like a military checkpoint. 6 men stood near the entrance, dressed in black tactical gear, plate carriers, rifles. But no military insignia, no unit patches, no flags. Private contractors, mercenaries. And they were arguing with the 2 hospital security guards who looked absolutely outmatched and terrified. I already told you we need to see the patient who came in on the military helicopter. Now, sir, I don't have authority to... The contractor's hand moved to his rifle. Not pointing it, not yet, but the threat was clear. Then get someone who does. Havoc and his SEALs emerged from the surgical wing at almost the same moment, their weapons immediately coming up to low-ready position. The 2 groups of armed men faced each other across the ER waiting room, while civilians scattered, screaming, diving behind chairs and reception desks. Stand down. Havoc ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. This is a civilian hospital. You're scaring innocent people. The lead contractor, a man in his 40s with a shaved head and cold gray eyes, smiled without humor. We're not here for civilians. We're here for your boy Ghost. He saw something he shouldn't have. Our employers would prefer he didn't wake up to talk about it. That's not happening, Havoc said flatly. It's not a request. The contractor's hand tightened on his rifle. You're outnumbered and in a public place. You really want to start a firefight in a hospital? Margaret had frozen at the entrance to the corridor, her mind racing through scenarios with the speed of someone who'd done this calculation 1,000 times before. 6 contractors, 4 SEALs, multiple civilians in the line of fire, limited cover. Hospital security completely unprepared for this situation. If shooting started, people would die. Innocent people. Dr. Hartwell grabbed her arm, his grip tight with panic. We need to evacuate, get patients out of... Margaret shook off his hand, her eyes never leaving the armed men. No time. Evacuation would take 20 minutes minimum. We don't have 20 minutes. Then what do we... She wasn't listening anymore. Her mind had shifted into a different mode. Tactical assessment, threat evaluation, resource inventory. The ER had 3 exits. The contractors were blocking the main entrance. The surgical wing where Ghost was being operated on had 1 access point currently protected by the SEALs. If the contractors pushed, it would be a choke point, a kill box, unless someone changed the equation. Margaret's hands were completely steady now. Her breathing slowed, measured, controlled. She felt the transformation happening inside her, the mask she'd worn for 8 months cracking and falling away completely. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd commanded men in combat. Preston, evacuate everyone you can from the ER. Use the East Wing exit. Quietly. Don't run. Don't panic the civilians. Whitfield stared at her, seeing someone he'd never met before. Margaret, what are you doing? She cut him off using the same command voice that had made Hartwell step back in the trauma bay. Then she started walking toward the waiting room, toward the armed men, her stride confident and measured. Not the shuffle of a nervous nurse, but the walk of someone who owned the ground beneath her feet. Margaret, don't. Whitfield hissed, but she was already gone. She entered the waiting room from the side corridor, moving with deliberate calm. Neither group noticed her immediately. They were too focused on each other, weapons raised, fingers near triggers, the tension thick enough to choke on. Gentlemen, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, you're going to want to reconsider this. Every head turned toward her. The contractors assessed her in a second. Small woman, 5'4", dirty blonde hair, messy, wearing oversized blue scrubs. Clearly a nurse. Clearly no threat. The lead contractor actually laughed. Ma'am, you need to leave. This doesn't concern you. Actually, Margaret said, still walking toward them, her hands visible and empty at her sides. It does. Because that patient you're here to kill, I'm the one who saved his life, which means I'm invested in making sure he stays alive. Havoc was watching her with sharp intensity, his weapon still trained on the contractors, but his attention split. She could see the calculation in his eyes, trying to figure out what she was doing, what her play was. The lead contractor's smile faded. Last warning, lady. Walk away. Margaret stopped 10 feet from him, close enough to be conversational, far enough to maintain some tactical distance, close enough that the SEALs had clear shots if needed. Her eyes locked onto the contractor's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable without quite knowing why. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to lower your weapons walk out of this hospital and report to your employers that the mission failed. Tell them the target was too well protected. Tell them whatever you want. She paused, her voice dropping lower. But you're not touching that patient. The contractor stared at her for a long moment, then actually laughed again. You're serious. You're a nurse. What are you going to do? Take my temperature aggressively. No, Margaret said, and something in her voice changed. Became harder, colder, utterly devoid of fear. I'm going to give you a professional assessment. She began walking again, circling slowly, her eyes never leaving the contractors. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd done this analysis 100 times in 100 different combat zones. You're running a 6-man team with suppressed HK-416s, which means you're trying to keep this quiet. You're wearing soft armor, not plates, which means you're prioritizing mobility over protection. You came in through the main entrance instead of breaching from multiple points, which means you're not military. You're contractors who got handed a simple termination mission and expected it to be easy. The contractor's smile vanished completely. Who the hell are you? But you made 3 mistakes, Margaret continued, ignoring the question. Her voice was clinical, now detached, like she was teaching a class on tactical failures. First, you assumed the SEALs wouldn't fight in a civilian hospital. They will. Second, you assumed hospital security was your only opposition. It's not. Her voice dropped even lower. And third, you assumed the scared little nurse wasn't a threat. She moved. Later witnesses would struggle to describe exactly what happened. One moment she was standing still talking. The next moment she was in motion, covering the 10 feet between her and the lead contractor in less than 2 seconds. Her hand struck his rifle with a precision that spoke of thousands of repetitions, knocking the barrel offline before he could react. Her other hand drove into his solar plexus with enough force to fold him in half, gasping for air that wouldn't come. She caught his rifle as he dropped it, spun it around with the fluid grace of someone for whom weapons were extensions of their body, and had it trained on the other contractors before any of them could process what had just happened. Her stance was textbook perfect. Feet shoulder width apart, weight balanced, the rifle seated firmly in her shoulder. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just cold professional competence. Don't. She said simply, and her voice carried absolute certainty that she would pull the trigger if they moved. The contractors froze. So did everyone else in the room. The entire ER held its breath. Havoc's voice cut through the stunned silence, a note of something like awe underneath the tactical assessment. Holy hell. Reaper. Margaret didn't take her eyes off the contractors, didn't lower the weapon, didn't even blink. Commander Sterling suggests you and your team secure these gentlemen while I maintain position. Roger that. Havoc, Commander Sterling said immediately, and there was something new in his voice now. Recognition, respect, understanding. The SEALs moved with coordinated efficiency, disarming the contractors one by one, zip-tying hands, clearing weapons. The whole operation took less than 30 seconds. They'd done this before many times, and they did it with the kind of smooth professionalism that came from years of training. Only when all 6 contractors were secured and disarmed did Margaret lower the rifle. She safed it with practiced ease, removed the magazine, cleared the chamber with the smooth motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and handed it to one of the SEALs. Then and only then did she allow herself to look at Commander Sterling. His dark eyes were wide with recognition and something close to disbelief. Reaper, Major General Margaret Dalton, 75th Ranger Regiment, then JSOC, then Pentagon Strategic Planning. He paused and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You're supposed to be dead. The statement hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Margaret stood perfectly still, meeting Commander Sterling's eyes, and for a long moment nobody moved. The contractors were secured on the floor, zip-tied and disarmed. The civilians had been mostly evacuated by Dr. Whitfield and hospital staff. The ER was silent except for the distant sound of approaching police sirens. I'm not dead, Margaret said finally, her voice quiet but steady. The adrenaline was starting to fade now, replaced by exhaustion and the crushing weight of exposure. Obviously. Sterling repeated, but his expression suggested he was still processing the impossibility of what he was seeing. The official report said you died in a helicopter crash in Yemen 8 months ago. Black Hawk went down during an extraction. No survivors. There was a memorial service. Full honors. Half of JSOC showed up. I was there, ma'am. I watched them fold the flag. There was a crash. Margaret acknowledged, and her hands began to tremble again, now that the immediate threat had passed. Not the fake tremor she'd maintained for 8 months, but something real. The physiological aftermath of combat, the body's response to extreme stress. The memorial was real. But I wasn't on that helicopter. One of Sterling's team members, the younger SEAL who'd spoken earlier, let out a low whistle. So you let everyone think you were KIA. Ma'am, with respect, that's necessary. Margaret cut him off and her hands were shaking harder now. Not from fear or nerves, but from adrenaline crash. From the toll of dropping her cover completely. From 8 months of careful control suddenly shattered. It was necessary. Dr. Hartwell had reappeared at some point during the confrontation, and now he stood at the edge of the waiting room, looking like his entire understanding of reality had just been rewritten. His perfect composure was completely gone, replaced by something approaching genuine shock. Major General, you were a... He couldn't even finish the sentence. I was a lot of things. Margaret said, still not looking away from Sterling. She owed him this much. An explanation, or at least the beginning of one. Ranger Medic first, then 75th Ranger Regiment, then JSOC, then Pentagon Strategic Planning. 22 years of service. And then 8 months ago, I walked away from all of it. Why, Sterling asked. It wasn't an accusation, just a genuine question from one soldier to another. The kind of question that deserved an honest answer. Margaret's expression flickered. Pain, regret, something that looked like grief washing across her features before she could lock it down. Because I was tired of watching people die. Because I'd given everything I had to give, and it still wasn't enough. Because... Her voice cracked slightly. Because the last mission I ran, I lost 16 operators. Good people. My people. And I realized I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't make those calls. Couldn't send people into situations where I knew some of them wouldn't come back. The ER was dead silent now. Even the secured contractors had stopped struggling, listening to something that felt too raw, too honest for this sterile hospital setting. So you faked your death, Sterling said slowly, working through the logistics of what that would have required. Went to ground, became a nurse, started over. Something like that. Margaret finally looked away, her gaze dropping to her hands. To the small shrapnel scars that marked them. To the tremor that had been fake for so long, but felt devastatingly real now. I thought if I could save lives one patient at a time in a civilian hospital, where the stakes were lower, where people weren't shooting at me, maybe that would be enough. Maybe I could find some kind of peace. Did you? One of the other SEALs asked quietly. Margaret's laugh was bitter-edged with something that might have been despair if she'd let it surface completely. What do you think? Before anyone could respond, one of the secured contractors spoke up, and his voice strained from his position, zip-tied on the floor. Your Reaper, the Reaper. He looked at his fellow contractors, and Margaret could see the moment recognition hit them all. The moment they understood exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. Holy shit, we're so screwed. Sterling glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. You know that name? Everyone in the contractor community knows that name. The man said, genuine fear in his voice now. The kind of fear that came from understanding you'd just gone up against a legend and lost. She's a goddamn myth. Led the operation that took down the Al-Zawrani network. Planned the extraction from Mogadishu that everyone said was impossible. Survived 3 helicopter crashes and got everyone out alive. Killed 12 hostiles in close quarters combat with nothing but a medical kit and a sidearm. He looked at Margaret with something close to awe. We thought you were dead. If we'd known you were here, we wouldn't have come within 10 miles of this place. That was kind of the point of being dead. Margaret said quietly. Sterling was studying her with new understanding pieces clicking into place. The way she'd moved, the tactical analysis, the perfect disarm. It all made sense now. That's why you were hiding, not from enemies, from recognition. Because if anyone from your old life saw you, they'd ask questions I didn't want to answer. Margaret finished. They had tried to pull me back in, tell me I was needed, that I had a duty, that I couldn't just walk away from everything I'd built. Her voice hardened slightly. But I already gave 22 years. I gave blood and sweat and pieces of my soul. I earned the right to choose something different. No one's arguing with that, ma'am, Sterling said carefully. But you have to know, when word gets out that you're alive, that you're here, word's not getting out. Margaret cut him off, her command voice returning for a moment. As far as anyone is concerned, Reaper died 8 months ago. Margaret Dalton is just a nurse who got in over her head tonight. Ma'am, respectfully, that ship has sailed, the young SEAL said, gesturing at the scene around them, at the secured contractors, at the hospital staff who'd witnessed everything, at the security cameras that had captured the whole confrontation. You just disarmed a hostile contractor in under 2 seconds, demonstrated expert weapon handling, revealed your identity to multiple witnesses. You can't put that back in the box. Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but movement at the ER entrance cut her off. Her body tensed automatically, ready for another threat. But it wasn't more contractors. 3 more men were entering, but these were different. They wore civilian clothes, expensive suits that screamed federal authority. The way they moved, the way they scanned the room, the way the lead man's eyes found Margaret immediately and locked on. These weren't contractors. These were the people contractors feared. The lead man was in his late 50s with iron gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime in command positions. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what power he wielded. Major General Dalton. He said it clearly, formally, making sure everyone in the room heard. I'm Director Raymond Cole, JSOC. We need to talk. I'm retired. Margaret said immediately, her body language shifting to defensive. I'm not coming back. Whatever you're here to offer, the answer is no. Cole stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to not be threatening. I'm not here to offer you anything, General. I'm here to inform you that your fake death is now a massive security problem. He gestured around the room. Multiple civilians saw you tonight. Your identity has been confirmed by SEAL team operators. Federal investigators have your fingerprints on multiple weapons. Hospital security cameras captured everything. We can't keep you dead anymore. So make me alive, Margaret said, and there was desperation creeping into her voice now. Bring me back officially. I'll accept whatever administrative punishment. Sit through whatever debriefings. Just let me go back to being a nurse. It's not that simple, Cole said, and there was something in his expression that looked almost sympathetic. The people you fought against tonight, they work for some very powerful individuals. Individuals who now know you're alive and might want revenge. Faking your death again won't work. Too many people know. Witness protection won't work. You have too many enemies in too many countries. He paused, letting that sink in. There's really only one option that keeps you safe. Margaret's jaw tightened. She could see where this was going, could feel the trap closing around her. Which is, come back, not to active combat operations, not to planning missions, but as an instructor. Train the next generation of combat medics and tactical operators. Teach them what you know. Share 22 years of experience with people who desperately need it. Cole took a step closer, his voice dropping. You said you were tired of watching people die. This is how you keep them alive, by making sure they are better prepared than you were. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Her hands had stopped shaking, but only because she'd clenched them into fists at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I can't watch more of them die. I can't. Then teach them not to, Sterling said quietly, and when Margaret looked at him, she saw understanding in his eyes. The understanding of someone who'd been there, who knew what it cost to send people into harm's way. Ma'am, General Reaper, whatever you want to be called, you're the best combat medic I've ever seen. The best tactical thinker. The best at keeping people alive under impossible conditions. If you'd trained my team, maybe we'd be better. Maybe more of us would come home. That's not fair, Margaret said. But there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. No, Sterling agreed, but it's true. When Cole pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the reception desk. I'm not going to force you, General. You've given enough that you've earned the right to choose. But think about it. You've got 48 hours before we need an answer. He paused at the door. If you decide to come back, call that number. If you don't, we'll do our best to protect you. But I won't lie to you, without official protection, without the resources of JSOC behind you, you're vulnerable. And there are people out there who'd very much like to finish what they started in Yemen. What do you mean finish what they started? Margaret's voice was sharp now, cutting through the room. Cole turned back, his expression grave. The helicopter crash that killed your pilots and supposedly killed you. It wasn't random enemy fire. It was targeted. Someone sold your extraction coordinates to hostile forces. Someone wanted you dead, General. And when we started investigating after tonight's incident, we found something interesting. He pulled out a tablet, tapped a few times, and showed Margaret the screen. The person who authorized the mission parameters for your Yemen operation. The person who had access to your extraction coordinates. The person who would have known exactly when and where your helicopter would be. Margaret looked at the screen. at the face she recognized, at the name that made everything suddenly horribly clear. General Adrian Blackwood. She said it like a curse. He was my commanding officer. He sent us into Yemen. He gave the order that got 16 of my operators killed. Cole nodded grimly, and now we know why. General Blackwood has been running a defense contracting empire on the side. $20 billion in fraudulent contracts over 15 years. Ghost witnessed one of his illegal arms deals in Syria. That's why the contractors are here. That's why Ghost had to die. He paused. And when Blackwood found out you'd survived the crash he arranged, when he learned you were alive and might start asking questions about Yemen, he sent contractors for you too. These 6 tonight, they weren't just here for Ghost General. They had orders to eliminate you if they got the chance. The room spun for a moment. Margaret felt like she'd been hit in the chest, all of it. The 16 operators, the helicopter crash, the 8 months of guilt and grief and thinking it was her fault. It was murder, premeditated, calculated. And the man who'd done it was still out there. Where is he? Margaret's voice was cold now. Colder than Sterling had ever heard it. The voice of someone who just had every shred of guilt transmuted into something far more dangerous. Where is Blackwood? He's in federal custody, Cole said. We arrested him 2 hours ago. He'll be charged with conspiracy, fraud, murder, treason. He's looking at life in prison minimum. I want to see him. Margaret said it like an order, not a request. General, I don't think Cole started. I want to see him now. Sterling stepped forward. Ma'am, maybe you should wait. Get some rest. Process this. Blackwood isn't going anywhere. Margaret turned to look at him, and what Sterling saw in her eyes made him take an involuntary step back. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. Something that had been forged in the grief of losing 16 people she'd sent to their deaths, refined by 8 months of guilt, and now tempered by the knowledge that it hadn't been her fault at all. Commander Sterling, with all due respect, I've waited 8 months. I've carried the weight of 16 deaths that I thought were my responsibility. I've hidden and run and tried to disappear because I thought I'd failed them. Her voice was perfectly controlled now, eerily calm. But I didn't fail them. They were murdered. And the man who murdered them is going to look me in the eye and know that I survived, that I'm still here, that everything he tried to bury is about to come to light. She turned back to Cole. Take me to him. That's not a request, Director. Cole studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Federal building, downtown. He's being held for arraignment. I can get you in, but General, I can't let you. I'm not going to hurt him, Margaret said, and there was something almost like a smile on her face. Cold and sharp as a blade. I'm just going to make sure he understands that he failed. Sometimes that's worse. 20 minutes later, Margaret stood outside an interrogation room in the federal building. Through the one-way glass, she could see General Adrian Blackwood. He was 61 years old, silver hair still military short, sitting in a cheap plastic chair with his wrists cuffed to the table. He looked smaller than she remembered. Diminished. Without the uniform, without the authority, without the power he'd wielded for so long, he was just an old man facing the consequences of his choices. Sterling stood beside her. He'd refused to let her come alone. You sure about this, ma'am? Margaret didn't answer. She was watching Blackwood through the glass, studying the man who'd shaped her career, who'd mentored her, who'd sent 16 of her people to their deaths for money. Cole appeared beside them. You've got 10 minutes. There are cameras, audio recording. Anything he says can and will be used in his trial. Understand? Margaret nodded. I understand. Cole opened the door. Margaret walked in. Blackwood looked up as she entered. For a moment, his face showed genuine shock. Then something else. Fear, maybe. Or resignation. Reaper. He said it quietly. They told me you survived. I didn't believe it until now. Margaret didn't sit. She stood across the table from him, hands at her sides, posture military perfect. You murdered 16 operators, Adrian. 16 of the best soldiers this country has ever produced. You sold them out for money. Blackwood had the grace to look away. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. The intelligence was meant to be slightly off. Delay the mission. They weren't supposed to walk into a full ambush. But they did. Margaret's voice was ice. And when they started dying, when I was listening to them scream over the comms, you said nothing. You let me believe it was my fault. You let me give the order that sent them in. You let me carry that guilt for 8 months. Blackwood looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes now. Not quite remorse, but close. I'm sorry, Margaret. Truly, you were the best operator I ever commanded. You didn't deserve that. You're right, I didn't. Margaret leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. But you know what I survived. I survived the crash you arranged. I survived 8 months of hiding. And I survived long enough to see you sitting here in handcuffs, about to spend the rest of your life in prison. She straightened. The 16 operators you murdered. I'm going to make sure every single person who graduates from the combat medical training program knows their names, knows their stories, knows that they died not because they weren't good enough, not because their commander made a mistake, but because someone they trusted betrayed them for money. Blackwood's face had gone pale. That is your legacy, Adrian. Not the empire you built, not the money you made. Just the memory of 16 dead patriots and the coward who sold them out. She turned to leave. Margaret. Blackwood's voice stopped her at the door. For what it's worth, I really am sorry. Margaret looked back at him one last time. So am I, Adrian. Adrian, I'm sorry I didn't see what you really were. I'm sorry I trusted you. I'm sorry it took 16 deaths and my own supposed death for the truth to come out. She paused, her hand on the door. But most of all, I'm sorry you didn't die in that helicopter crash instead of me, because at least then you would have died with your honor intact. Now you'll die knowing everyone knows exactly what you are. She walked out without looking back. Sterling was waiting in the hallway. He didn't say anything, just fell into step beside her as they walked toward the exit. Feel better? He asked quietly when they reached the parking garage. No, Margaret said honestly, but I feel less guilty. And right now, that's enough. She pulled out the business card Cole had given her and looked at it for a long moment. I'm going to call him. Accept the position. Sterling nodded. Good. The program needs you, he paused. But that's not the only reason, is it? Margaret looked up at him. Number, it's because those 16 operators deserve better than to die in an ambush. They deserve better training, better intelligence, better leadership. I can't bring them back, but I can make sure the next generation has what they didn't. She got into her car, and because hiding didn't honor them, teaching does. 6 months later, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The sign outside the new building read, Combat Medical Training Center. Director Brigadier General Margaret Dalton. Inside a classroom filled with 30 young medics, military and civilian, all listening intently as Margaret stood at the front. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform crisp, the thin scar above her eyebrow visible, and no longer something to hide. Most of you will never see combat, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. But someday you'll face a situation where everything goes wrong, where the patient is dying, where protocol doesn't work, where you have to make a choice, follow the rules and watch them die, or break the rules and maybe save them. She paused, looking at each face in turn, so many of them young, so many of them about to step into situations they couldn't imagine yet. I'm here to teach you how to make that choice and how to live with it after. A young female medic raised her hand. Ma'am, is it true you were declared killed in action? Margaret smiled slightly, not the cold smile she'd given Blackwood, but something warmer, something that suggested healing, slow but steady. Yes. For 8 months I hid because I couldn't face what I'd lost, because I thought 16 good people died because of my failure. She gestured at the classroom, at the students, at the memorial plaque on the wall that listed 16 names. But hiding didn't honor them. Teaching you does, making sure you're better prepared, better trained, better equipped than they were. That's how I honor their memory. The student nodded, understanding in her eyes. Class ended. The students filed out, energized and focused. Margaret gathered her materials, preparing for the next session. Commander Sterling was waiting outside, leaning against the wall. Over the past 6 months, their professional relationship had evolved into something neither of them had been looking for, but both had found. Something built on mutual respect, shared experience, and the understanding that sometimes the best relationships were forged in the aftermath of trauma. Dinner? He asked. Yeah, let me just... Her phone buzzed. A text from Cole. Ghost testified this morning. Senate hearing. 40 indictments handed down. Blackwood and 39 co-conspirators. Biggest military corruption case in U.S. history. You did good, General. Margaret showed the text to Sterling. 40 people, he said. That's a lot of lives you saved. Not just Ghost, but everyone those contractors would have hurt if Blackwood's network had stayed hidden. Margaret looked back at the training center. Through the window, she could see the next class gathering. Young faces, eager, ready to learn. 40 people is good, she said quietly. But these, she gestured at the students, these are the ones I'm really saving. One student at a time, one procedure at a time, one deployment at a time. They walked together across the Fort Bragg campus, comfortable in the silence that came from mutual understanding. Ghost testified well, Sterling asked after a while. According to Cole, he was incredible. Calm, detailed, unshakable. The senators were impressed. Where is he now? Margaret smiled. Consulting for the program. Helps teach tactical medicine. Says if he's going to survive getting shot, he might as well make sure the next person who takes a bullet has someone who knows what they're doing. That sounds like Ghost. They reached Margaret's truck, the same beat-up vehicle she'd driven as a nurse, but somehow it fit better now. No more pretending. No more hiding. Sterling stopped her before she could get in. I never thanked you properly. For saving Ghost. For stopping the contractors. For everything. You don't need to thank me, Margaret said. Yes, I do. Sterling's voice was serious now. Because you didn't just save Ghost that night. You reminded all of us what real leadership looks like. What it means to put the mission first, even when it costs you everything. He paused. The trembling nurse act, the hiding, you could have lived that lie forever. But you didn't. When it mattered, when lives were on the line, you stepped up. That's who you are, Margaret. That's who Reaper is. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. I'm still figuring out who I am, Wyatt. After Yemen, after hiding, after everything with Blackwood. I don't know if I'm Reaper or Margaret or something in between. Sterling smiled. Then figure it out. You've got time. And he gestured at the training center. You've got purpose. That's more than most people ever find. Margaret climbed into her truck, started the engine. See you tomorrow, Sterling nodded. Tomorrow. And Margaret. She looked at him. The program's official numbers came in. 500 medics trained in 6 months. 0 fatalities in combat situations where our graduates were the primary medical personnel. 0, he let that sink in. You're saving lives. Real lives. Just like you wanted. Margaret drove away, Sterling's words echoing in her mind. That evening, she sat in her small apartment on base. It was sparse but no longer empty. Photos on the wall now, not hidden away in a drawer but displayed with honor. Her wedding photo, the husband she'd lost to cancer 5 years ago. The reason she'd thrown herself into work, into missions, into anything that would fill the void he'd left. The photo of her 16 operators. Young faces, confident smiles taken the day before the Yemen mission. She looked at them every day now, remembered their names, honored their service. And a new photo, one she'd had framed just last week. Herself and Sterling and Ghost and the first graduating class of combat medics. 30 faces, all alive, all trained, all ready. On her desk, a letter she'd written but not yet sent, addressed to the families of the 16 operators, telling them the truth about how their sons and daughters and husbands and wives had died, telling them about Blackwood's arrest, telling them about the training program that would carry their loved ones' names forward. She picked up her pen and signed it, in service and in memory. Brigadier General Margaret Reaper Dalton. Then she sealed it, addressed it, and set it with the others to be mailed tomorrow. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sterling. Thought you should know. 3 more bases requested the training program. Word spreading about what you're building here. Margaret smiled and typed back. Good. The more people we train, the more lives we save. She set the phone down and walked to the window. Outside, Fort Bragg was settling into evening. Soldiers running drills. The flag lowering for the day. The familiar rhythms of military life that she'd thought she'd left behind forever. But this was different. This wasn't about sending people into danger. This was about giving them the tools to survive it, to come home, to live. Margaret picked up a notebook, opened it to a fresh page, and began planning the next course. Advanced trauma management, battlefield triage, chemical exposure treatment, all the things she'd learned in 22 years distilled into lessons that could save lives. She worked late into the night as she often did now, but it wasn't the desperate work of someone running from guilt. It was the purposeful work of someone who'd found their calling. Around midnight, she finally set down her pen and looked at what she'd written. A complete curriculum for the next 6 months. Aggressive, comprehensive, demanding. It would be hard. The students would struggle. Some would fail. But the ones who succeeded would be the best trained combat medics in the world. They would save lives. They would come home. They would survive. And that, Margaret realized, was enough. She stood stretched and looked one more time at the photo of her 16 operators. I'm still here, she said quietly to their frozen, smiling faces. Still fighting, still teaching, still making sure your deaths meant something. She turned off the light and headed to bed. Tomorrow, 30 new students would arrive for training. 30 more people she could prepare. 30 more lives she could help save. The trembling hands were gone. The mask was gone. The guilt was fading. What remained was purpose, mission, legacy. Major General Margaret Reaper Dalton had stopped hiding, and in the process she'd found something she thought she'd lost in Yemen. She'd found herself. Epilogue. 1 year later. The Combat Medical Training Center had expanded to 3 buildings now. Over 1,000 medics trained. Deployment statistics showing unprecedented survival rates in combat medical situations. Margaret stood at a podium in the main auditorium looking out at 200 faces. The largest graduating class yet. "You are the best trained combat medics in the world," she said, and she meant it. "You know more about battlefield medicine than I did at your age. You're better equipped, better prepared, better ready for what you're about to face." She paused. "But you're still going to be scared. You're still going to face situations where everything goes wrong, where the protocols fail, where you have to make impossible choices." The room was silent, hanging on every word. "When that happens, remember this. You're not alone. Every technique I taught you, every procedure you learned, every decision, tree we drilled into you, those came from experience, from mistakes, from lessons learned in blood and fire and loss." She looked at the memorial wall where 16 names were carved in marble. "You stand on the shoulders of people who gave everything so you could be better than they were. Honor them. Honor their sacrifice. Honor their memory." She straightened. "And when you come home, not if, when you'll have stories to tell, lessons to share, experience to pass on." Her eyes found Sterling in the back of the room. He smiled. "And maybe someday you'll stand where I'm standing now, teaching the next generation, making sure they're even better than you were." She paused one last time. "That's how we honor the fallen. Not by mourning them, but by making sure their deaths buy something lasting, something that saves lives for generations to come." The graduating class stood as one and saluted. Margaret returned the salute crisp and perfect. Dismissed. As the students filed out celebrating, heading toward their next assignments, their next deployments, their next challenges, Margaret remained at the podium. Sterling approached. "Hell of a speech, General." Margaret smiled. "Think it worked?" He gestured at the departing students, at their confident strides, their eager faces. "Look at them. You didn't just train them, you inspired them. There's a difference, Wong." Margaret watched the last student leave, then turned to Sterling. "You know what the best part is, what? In 6 months, they'll start coming back, sharing their own stories, their own lessons, their own experience." She looked at the memorial wall again. "And the cycle continues. The fallen teach the living honor the fallen, and we get better, generation by generation." Class by class, Sterling put his hand on her shoulder. "You did good, Margaret, really good." "We did good," she corrected. "I couldn't have built this alone." They walked out together into the North Carolina sunshine toward the next class, already gathering toward the next generation, waiting to learn toward the future. They were building one student at a time. Behind them, carved in marble above the memorial wall, words Margaret had chosen carefully. "They gave their lives so others might live. We honor them by teaching others to save lives." The mission continues. And it did. Every day, every class, every life saved. The mission continued. And Major General Margaret Reaper Dalton, once hidden, once broken, once lost, had finally found her way home. Not to the past, but to purpose. And that made all the difference.